Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. This week's deep dive is on big tech, the military, and artificial intelligence. Because big tech is now starting to intertwine with the US military. And this should be cause for concern, but it should also be cause for discussion as well. And I was recently reading an excellent article in FT by Jonathan Geyer on this. And if you didn't know, OpenAI just revealed that it has won its very first Pentagon contract, and they are piloting a $200 million program, according to the U.S. Department of Defense, and I quote, to develop prototype frontier AI capabilities to address critical national security challenges in both warfighting and enterprise domains. That a major tech company could launch military work with so little public scrutiny really underscores a shift that we are seeing here in the United States. The national security application of just everyday apps has in effect become a given. So, armed with narratives about how they've supercharged Israel and Ukraine in their wars, some tech companies are now basically framing this and positioning themselves as patriotic or with patriotism for the United States. However, what about the conversation on whether this should actually be happening? Right? I mean, this is what we need to understand. How about we ensure that ethics and safety are prioritized before we actually see these two get in bed with each other? Now, technology has always been in warfare. I mean, think about everything from the bow and arrow to gunpowder, trebuchets, nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, airplanes, etc., etc. But we are now accelerating this thanks to the internet, thanks to Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley has been dominant in technology basically for the last 30, 40 years. That's not to say there are other big players outside of the United States. There are. But the center of what technology and what's driven the internet, social media, and everything else has been Silicon Valley for the most part. And so Silicon Valley and the Pentagon have always been intertwined. But this is OpenAI's first step into military contracting, and OpenAI is pioneering artificial intelligence. They were the first to bring out ChatGPT, and there's plenty of competitors, don't get me wrong, but they put this on the map. So OpenAI has been building a national security team with alumni from the Biden administration, and only last year did it quietly remove a ban on using its apps for such things as weapon development and warfare. They originally said for years that they weren't going to do this, and then they quietly backed off of that. And by the end of 2024, OpenAI had actually partnered with Anduril. That's basically the startup that's headed by Palmer Luckey. He's a big Trump supporter, et cetera, if you know who Palmer Luckey is. And this is a perception shift for big tech and its personnel as well. If you recall, big tech has changed dramatically since 2018 when Google staffers had protested against a secret Pentagon effort called Project Maven with Google over ethical concerns. That led Google to actually let that contract expire. But now, Google has totally revised its approach. Google Cloud is collaborating with Lockheed Martin on generative AI, Lockheed Martin being one of the big war-fighting prime contractors of essentially the United States military. On top of it, we've got Meta, aka Mark Zuckerberg, one of the most unethical people on the planet. Go see my video/podcast/radio segment entitled "It's Time to Put Mark Zuckerberg in Jail." But Meta too has changed its policies so that the military can use Llama AI. Amazon and Microsoft, they're all in. Anthropic has partnered with Palantir to get Claude to the US military, and on and on and on. And so it's easy to imagine AI's advantages here, but what's missing from the public view is the conversation about these risks. It's now well documented that AI sometimes hallucinates or takes on a life of its own. On a more structural level, consumer tech may not be secure enough for national security uses. We recently just saw the whole Signalgate thing where the Secretary of Defense was caught using Signal to communicate war plans, et cetera, or attack plans, whatever you want to call it. But this is an issue. A recent survey by the Institute of Global Affairs, basically on the US, UK, France, and Germany, found that the majorities of the population surveyed support stricter regulations when it comes to military AI. People worry, obviously, that it could be weaponized by adversaries or used by their own governments to surveil citizens. And yes, absolutely, that's one of the big fears we are seeing with what looks like an aggregation of U.S. government data on all of the citizens that looks like it's being handed over from Doge to Palantir. I've talked about that before as well. The respondents of that survey, though, were offered 8 statements, half emphasizing AI's benefits basically to their country's military and the other half emphasizing risk. In the UK, less than half, or 43%, said that AI would help their country's military improve its workflow. A large majority, 80%, said that these new technologies needed to be more regulated to protect people's rights and freedoms. Using AI for war could, at its most extreme, mean entrusting a flawed algorithm in questions of life or death. I've actually talked about this in previous segments. Imagine this gets fed a whole bunch of intel and it makes the wrong conclusion, which sends, I don't know, SEAL Team 6 or whomever, some special forces outfit, to its death when they walk into a trap or an ambush, or they just show up in the wrong place. This is, for the record, is already happening in the Middle East. The Israeli news outlet known as Plus 972 Magazine has investigated Israel's military AI and its targeting of Hamas leaders in Gaza and reported that, and I quote, thousands of Palestinians, most of them women and children or people who were not involved in the fighting, were wiped out by Israeli airstrikes, especially during the first weeks of the war because of the AI program's decisions. So this is already here. This is already happening. The U.S. military, for the record, has used AI for select targets in the Middle East, but senior Pentagon official talking to Bloomberg last year said that it wasn't reliable enough to act on its own. In other words, right now, the military isn't taking the AI at its word, but as AI improves, that could change. Now, an open conversation about what it means for tech giants to work with the military is long overdue. Now, what's interesting is Miles Brundage, he's a former OpenAI researcher, warned, and I quote, AI companies should be more transparent than they currently are about which national security, law enforcement, and immigration-related use cases they do and don't support, with which countries/agencies, and how they enforce these rules. In other words, we don't have transparency, and they're not saying anything like this. But the integration, and here's the thing, the integration of big tech in the military is getting closer and closer and closer. And Steve Beynon of military.com had a good write-up on this because the Army, U.S. Army, has now directly commissioned 4 big tech executives to be lieutenant colonels in the U.S. Army. These 4 people have no military background, and they will not recuse themselves from business dealings with the Department of Defense. So earlier this month in June, the Army announced Detachment 201 for these newly commissioned executives of Palantir, Meta, and OpenAI. This new formation is basically set to recruit tech executives to work on major Army challenges, but the service has not articulated exactly what those individuals would do. Instead, they're focusing on recruiting talent and creating jobs around them. Now, the 4 include Shyam Sankar, he's the Chief Technology Officer at Palantir, Andrew Bosworth, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Meta, Kevin Weil, who's the Chief Product Officer of OpenAI, and Bob McGrew, he's an advisor at Thinking Machines Labs, a former Chief Research Officer for OpenAI as well. And just before Bosworth, for the record, was sworn in, Meta announced a deal with defense technology company Anduril to pursue military contracts that involve artificial intelligence with augmented reality that could be worth millions of dollars. I mentioned that a little earlier, but these are the kinds of pairings that we're starting to see. Now, sources also raised red flags about how the Army actually handled this rollout, calling it a self-inflicted optics nightmare. Service officials basically have insisted that none of these executives will be involved in decision-making on government contracts, but there is virtually no systemic oversight on that potential conflict of interest. The decision to grant officer commissions to executives with no military background without clear recusal from future defense business obviously is now sparking concerns of both ethical lapses but also blurred lines. Several officials warn that any future Pentagon deals involving these companies could be tainted by perceptions of favoritism, potentially basically souring relationships with competing contractors and casting a shadow over future acquisitions. Now, on top of this, I also think that what it means is that those that weren't included, Amazon and Microsoft, didn't have tech executives sworn in as lieutenant colonels. They're going to want in on this too. right? I mean, they both have FedRAMP in the cloud. They are hardened their infrastructure, at least aspects of their infrastructure, for military work and government work. And so what we are going to see is this basically commingling. Now, unfortunately, at the very beginning of the year, on January 20th or January 21st, essentially, the guardrails about ethical development of artificial intelligence were rescinded. It was originally an executive order by President Biden that was rescinded by President Trump. So we don't really have guardrails on what the AI can and cannot do. It's applications for surveillance as it sifts through data, sorts through data. Not to mention companies in the past like Raytheon had developed essentially an understanding through GPS location of predictability. And it was something like 80% prediction if they had enough information on you to understand where you'd be up to 6 months, because we're creatures of habit. Not to mention being able to surveil anything that, let's say, Meta, aka Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc., chooses to feed into an artificial intelligence on behalf of the government to start surveilling the entire social media populations that they control, maybe looking for, I don't know, haters on the government, terrorists, whatever it is. Not to mention the AI applications that could potentially get members of the service, such as special forces, or even entire divisions of the military, if there's some kind of invasion, in trouble if the artificial intelligence makes some kind of mistake. These are things that we actually have to discuss, because these are the things that are coming down the road. This isn't something that we can take lightly or simply, shovel aside and all of that. And I understand everybody has their own distractions in life, trying to avoid the politics of the day, which, you should be reading what's going on with your government, and says, but I know everybody's into sports or famous people or whatever it is. These are things that we can't let slide. And these are things that require our attention. And if we don't give it this kind of attention, this is basically when it comes to fruition. And now it's that much harder to de-untrench or untrench or whatever you want to call it. So take that for what it's worth, but pay attention to this. And I'm going to pay attention to this. I'm going to keep informing you on this, but this is of deep, deep concern, I think, to the world, and it should be of concern to you and I and everybody else. And it's not just in the United States. While the United States is militarizing its big tech and artificial intelligence, obviously, the rest of the world can do the same as well. And that doesn't bode well for the populations, right? It might bode well for the governments or who is in charge of the government. But you and I kind of get stuck in the middle of all of this. So I'll leave it at that. This is something to watch. It is deeply concerning, and best of luck to us all. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at Nick AESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.